Hello and welcome all of you to Neva Yes. This is the first of a series of videos where we will discuss all the history and culture mains questions that has been asked since 2014 till 2023. So this is part of our flagship mains program called MAINia. Here, as I said, we will be discussing the mains questions, and the theme for today is Gandhara art. The reason why we took Gandhara art is because UPSC has asked it twice, once in 2019 and before that 5 years back in 2014. You see, the major theme of both these questions are Gandhara art. Even though there are slight discrepancies with respect to the demand of the question, the central theme remains Gandhara art. This should also be a reminder for you that UPSC will repeat itself. The same theme would be very rewarding for you if you study it as per the pattern of the PYQs. So we'll start this. As I've said, this is the first of a series of videos where we will discuss all the history and cultures questions of the past 10 years. So we will have the questions from ancient and medieval India from the perspective of art and culture, because for mains you don't have a political angle. Then you have questions from modern India, you have questions from post-independence consolidation, and finally you have questions from the world history. So all these four themes will be covered under the history and culture mania mains PYQ discussion. Let's start with Gandhara art without wasting any time. So both the questions are 10 markers, and both the questions have a very specific dimension to it. Even though the central theme is Gandhara art, both the questions differ in a specific dimension. See the first question. It asks you to highlight the Central Asian and Greco-Bactrian elements in Gandhara art. So the emphasis is not on Gandhara art, but the Central Asian and the Greco-Bactrian elements. So any question in history, you need to have a certain factual base to attempt that. You cannot just narrate the current events in history questions. You need to have some kind of a base. I'll explain that base that you need for Gandhara art first in this question, but that is needed. That is the first understanding you should have. When you come to the second question, see that the question becomes more specific towards sculpture. Here it is about art in general, here it becomes sculpture. Even though the Gandhara art is largely revolving around sculptures, that too Buddhist sculptures, here it is generalistic in nature, here it has become more specific. And it asks specifically about the Roman and the Greek elements, no reference of the Central Asian elements. So when you study this particular question, you should understand what Gandhara art is, what are the various contributions that it had, and within that, what are the specific Central Asian elements, what are the specific Roman elements, what are the specific Greek elements. Because Gandhara art on a whole is an amalgamation. It's an art that has evolved as a result of amalgamation of various cultures. UPSC is asking you to differentiate it and express it. Unless you know that differentiation, you are not going to score more than 5 marks. If you know Gandhara art, you will score 2 and 2.5 marks. But if you know more than that, you will score more than 5 marks in this question, because everybody cannot attempt this question. Now let's move into the question. How do we break down this? Now, when you approach any question in history for the mains, most of the times you will be able to place this particular keyword that's given in the question in a temporal and spatial dimension. Temporal dimension means you can place it in the dimension of time. Spatial dimension means you can place it in the dimension of space. Just like that, in this question, you can place it in the dimension of time, where 326 BC becomes an important period. What is the relevance of 326 BC? That is the time period when Alexander the Great invaded India. So Alexander invaded India in 326 BC. After that, you have a long reign of Mauryas in India. And during this period, after the decline of Mauryas, you have an instability in this region. So the Mauryan capital was Pataliputra, and their reign extended all over India except in some parts of Kerala. They had a pan-Indian control. It was one of the first pan-Indian dynasties. But after that, the Alexandrian invasion came. Then the Mauryas declined. Then you have a series of other empires in the northwestern region. And that empire actually leads to the formation of a mixed art form and a mixed culture in the form of Gandhara art. When you talk about Gandhara art, you always have a binary in the name of Madhura art. Madura art is centered around this Indo-Gangetic plain, and that has more Indian features. One example I can give is the Buddha in Madura art has a chubby face, whereas Buddha in the Gandhara has a much more elongated face like the Greek gods. Now, when you come to the introduction, you take the time period, that is post 326 BC, you place the region, which is northwestern India, then you take the dynasties. The major pattern of the Gandhara art was the Kushanas. So Kushana is a tribe that came from the current day Chinese region. Kujula Kadapsis was the first emperor. The most famous emperor is Kanishka, and their peak time was 1st century BC, and during that time they had their initial capital in Gandhara only. So they were the major patrons of this. And you have the Indo-Greeks in this region. You have the Scythians, popularly known as the Sagas. So it is these three dynasties that led to the mixture of culture and the evolution of the Gandhara art. So you can take these three dynasties in your introduction. That will be a great value addition. Then, since the question is not necessarily about defining the Gandhara art, you can attempt to define Gandhara art in the introduction itself. So Gandhara art can be defined as an art form that is a mixture of a lot of cultures, including the Hellenistic culture, the Central Asian culture, and the local Indian culture. So an art form that evolved as a process of cultural amalgamation or cultural mixture. So if you can bring all these four elements in the introduction, it will be such a good introduction with a lot of value addition. Now let's come to the body part of the first question. You have two key elements. One is the Central Asian element. Second is the Greco-Bactrian element. And what UPSC has asked you to do is to highlight it. Now let's see, whatever I have marked in red in this answer sheet, all of them are very important keywords. That is what will differentiate your answer from a normal answer or an average answer. So that is why it is marked in red here. You can structure it as per the black bold letters, but try to follow or pick up these red highlighted parts as it is, because they are the very key elements to it. That is what will give the impression that you know the question. Now coming to the Central Asian elements. See, first of all, you should understand that it is very difficult to differentiate between what is amalgamated through culture. Because if you take Indian culture right now, several elements like the tea, for example, it came from China, or the samosa that we have, or the sari that we wear. These things come from different places. To differentiate it is very difficult because it travels through time and space. So when you talk about something like Gandhara art, differentiating will be difficult, and elements under each separate heads will be minimized. So whatever we have specifically should be very clear and should be taken and presented in the answer. Now come to the Central Asian elements. Here you have to understand that when you talk about Central Asia in the ancient Indian context, we are not talking about the modern Indian context or the modern world scenario. So Central Asia in the past was dominated by the Persian Empire. This Persian Empire ruled over by famous rulers like Cyrus, Xerxes. So this Persian Empire was based in Iran, but it extended to other regions as well. What we call West Asia today is dominated by the Persian Empire. So in the modern understanding, when we talk about Central Asian elements, we are restricting ourselves to Kazakhstan and all that countries in that central region around the Caspian Sea. And we consider the region around Iran or the region around the Arabian Peninsula as West Asia. But when we talk about Central Asia in the ancient context, we will take the Persian Empire into account, and that is the sense with which it is asked in this question as well. Take the first element, the halo. Halo, if you take the Buddha face like this, a halo will be present around the head. So halo has its origin traced back to the solar dynasties in Persian art. A very clear example that you can quote here. Second is the cap, the conical cap of the Scythians. So Scythians or the Sagas were nomadic tribes who had their origin in the region that we just mentioned, which is the Persia, which is present-day Iran. Then they emerged as a major dynasty, and they had a significant feature marking their identity, which was conical caps like this. They had a cap like this, and this cap can be seen in some of the Buddha statues as well. So this is a Central Asian contribution. And finally, we have the fire worship. So around the Buddha statues, you have a lot of motifs in Gandhara art. You will have a frame like this, and you will have a lot of motifs. And in this motifs, you can see something like a fire worship also, which is a Central Asian contribution. Now, if you have a question on Gandhara art plainly, you can mix all these and present. But if when you are asked to differentiate these three items under the head of Central Asian elements. Now coming to the Greco-Bactrian elements, here we haven't differentiated between Roman and Greek elements. We are taking it as a single unit. Later for the second question, we will divide them one by one. Now when you take the Greco-Bactrian elements, the first thing is the material that they used. The material that they used mainly for Gandhara art is schist stone. Second is the drapery. So one thing that differentiated Gandhara art from the Madura art is the naturalistic depiction. When we see the Buddha images of the Madura art, it is not that natural or human-like. You have Buddha with a very big face, very big body, very elongated ear. It is not natural. It is symbolic in nature, but it is not natural or human-like. But when it comes to the Gandhara art, it is very natural, and they make it natural with elements like drapery. There is a thick drapery. When it comes to the Indian or the Madura forms, the drapery becomes more and more attached to the body. And one form of art that evolved later was the Saranath school. And this Saranath school, in this Saranath school of art, the drapery becomes almost transparent and attached to the body. So drapery is an important differentiating factor when it comes to these sculpture schools. So when it comes to the Roman school, be very clear that they had a very thick drapery, and that was one of the defining factors giving naturalistic appeal. Then you have a youthful Buddha, just like Apollo. Because if you take all the Greek gods and their images, like Apollo, like Zeus, like Aphrodite, they were all depictions of human beauty with a muscular physique. The most popular example would be Hercules, very muscular physique and very youthful in nature. Just like that, they transformed the Buddha also like that, muscularly built, youthful in nature. And there are some very differentiating factors, and one is the urna or the third eye. This dot is a very specific feature of the Gandhara art form. You can attempt to draw a Buddha face in the answer sheet. One thing to add value to your answer would be a map. You can draw a map like this, and you can mark the northwestern region, marking all these three dynasties that I've told you, the Kushanas, the Parthians, the Indo-Greeks. You can mark it like that. The next best thing is to do is to draw a very skeletal form of Buddha's face and mark this. See this urna? It's a very defining feature of the Gandhara art. Second is the anthropomorphic representation. So it is connected to the previous point that we discussed, that Buddha is more natural and human-like. Just look at these features. Curly hair. Curly hair is something that we won't see in Indian faces. That is the Madura school I am referring to. Just see here. Buddha with the curly hair, which is wavy also in nature. I have given an example here, the fasting Buddha statue. Then you have the wine scrolls. I've already talked to you about the motifs that are present around the Gandhara sculpture. There you can find the wine scrolls. Wine scrolls are part of the Mediterranean culture, something that you won't find in the Indian subcontinent. So this is an element that was brought as a contribution of the Roman and the Greek culture. I've already told you about the halo as the first point. Here you can see a halo. Then you have the idea of iconography. Iconography means you use an icon to add more meaning, more larger than life meaning to an image. So you have sculptures where Atlas is supporting Buddha. So when Atlas is supporting Buddha, Buddha is elevated on top of Atlas as a much bigger figure. So such kind of an iconography. In India also you can see iconography. In the Sanchi Stupa you can see Queen Mayavati's dream. Or there is a lot of iconography. You use the Buddha's feet to represent something. You use the Abhaya Mudra to represent something. Just like that, iconography is part. Such iconography like Atlas supporting that, or depictions of Hercules, read it as Hercules. These depictions are part of the Greco-Bactrian influence. And finally, you have sharp outlines and smooth surface. See the surface, it is very smooth. And see the outline, it is very sharp. Just look at here, see the eyebrows, very sharp. So sharp outlines, these are part of the realistic features. So if you know the broad idea that Gandhara art is more naturalistic and realistic, you can bring out these points. Take care of these red highlighted things, urna, wavy hair, fasting Buddha, wine scroll. These things should be brought in your answer to add more value to that. Now let's come to the second question. Here now we have differentiated between the Central Asian elements and the Greco-Bactrian elements. Now, what UPSC has asked you to do in 2014 is to split it further between the Roman and the Greek elements. A very difficult exercise because both have a lot of integration towards each other. But one natural framework through which you can differentiate them would be in this way. So one idea with regard to Greek would be, when you talk about Greek or the Greek culture, always remember the Greek gods. So they have a culture like that where the gods are worshipped, a culture that is so revolving around a mythology like Iliad and Odyssey, where you have gods like Zeus, Aphrodite, Hercules. So they have that features in their art form as well, the Hellenistic features. It is there, these features like the iconography. So you can actually split the features that we have mentioned in this section and put it under these two frameworks. All the naturalistic and Hellenistic features can be put under the Greek template. So all these things, the wavy hair, the iconography of Atlas supporting Buddha, the sharp outline, smooth surface, all these things can be brought under the Hellenistic features. And now what comes under the Roman features? The material, the sheer stone. That's a Roman contribution. Then the motifs, like the wine scrolls. This is a Roman contribution. And finally, the drapery, the garments that is used. Because if you look at old Roman statues, like the Julius Caesar, you just observe the drapery that they're using. Such drapery is a feature of the Roman art. So here you can differentiate easily between Greek and Roman elements, one in the context of naturalism and Hellenistic features, and other in the context of material, motifs and garments. And sometimes both have used same materials, and as I've said, the integration is very much. And now how do you conclude the answer? As I've said, in introduction you can follow a template, and in conclusion you always be futuristic. Is Gandhara art the only art form where you can see cultural amalgamation in India? No. The question itself is about amalgamation. Even though it doesn't explicitly mention the term, it implicitly says that it is a mixture of different cultures. So you rely on that point in the conclusion. So I'm suggesting one way of concluding it. You can have your own ways of concluding it. One way would be to rely on that point and say that India is known for such mixed cultures, which is reflecting in the art forms as well. One example is the Indo-Islamic art. We call it Indo-Islamic because it has Indian and Islamic elements. Or if you take the Ashokan pillar for example, it is indebted to the Achaemenid pillars. The only difference is that was in different parts, the Ashokan pillar was in a single stone. So India is known for such mixture of cultures when it comes to the domain of art. You can mention this point here and finish this answer on a futuristic note. So that's the discussion of this particular answer. Once again, this gives you the idea that UPSC repeats itself on a core concepts. I hope the discussion was very productive for you. We'll come back with a different topic under the history and culture MAINia of new IAS. Thank you for listening.